The trench was a place where time seemed to lose all meaning, a place where the hours bled together in an endless, torturous haze. The men in the trenches had long since lost track of how many days had passed, how many weeks or months had slipped by since they first set foot in this hellish landscape. The world outside felt like a distant memory, a time before the mud, the rats, the constant stench of decay and death. The battlefield was a vast expanse of suffering, with no clear purpose or end in sight. Every moment spent in this wasteland only deepened the despair that gripped the men who found themselves there. The war had been supposed to be a short, heroic affair, an adventure that would bring glory and victory. But now, it had stretched far beyond anyone's expectations, and the promises of honor and patriotism had become hollow. The reality of trench warfare was far more brutal than any of them had imagined. The men were no longer soldiers in the traditional sense, at least not in the way they had once understood the word. They had become survivors. Survival, not victory, was the only goal that mattered. And with each passing day, the line between the two became more and more blurred. The trench itself was a testament to human endurance and suffering. It was a long, narrow ditch carved into the earth, lined with sandbags, wooden planks, and barbed wire. The men lived, ate, slept, and fought in this confined space, surrounded by filth and constant danger. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and the acrid smell of gunpowder that never seemed to leave the atmosphere. The mud, ever present, clung to their boots and hands, thick and slippery, a constant reminder of the conditions they had to endure. The sounds of the battlefield were ever present: distant explosions, the crackle of gunfire, the eerie whistle of artillery shells as they cut through the sky. But it wasn't just the sounds of war that haunted the men. It was the silence that would occasionally settle over the trench, a silence that seemed more oppressive than the noise of battle itself. In those quiet moments, the weight of their situation would crash down upon them, a suffocating reminder of the endless suffering that surrounded them. In the beginning, they had come to the front with a sense of purpose. They were going to fight for their country, for freedom, for something greater than themselves. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, that sense of purpose began to erode. It was replaced by something far darker: apathy, numbness, a sense of hopelessness that began to take root in their souls. They had seen too much death, too much destruction, and had lived too long in this hellish environment to believe in anything but survival. The ideals that had once fueled their courage now felt like distant, almost laughable memories. The romantic notion of war had been shattered by the grim reality they faced each day. But there was one thing that continued to gnaw at them, one thing that made their existence in the trenches even more unbearable than the constant threat of death or injury: hunger. The men were always hungry, always craving food that seemed so far out of reach. Their rations, when they arrived, were meager at best, often stale bread, a few slices of meat, and sometimes, if they were lucky, a tin of beans. It was never enough. The hunger became an all-consuming force, gnawing at their insides, making it difficult to think of anything else. The men would sit huddled together in the cold, their stomachs growling, their bodies weakened by lack of nourishment. They could feel the hunger deep within them, a constant reminder that they were being starved not just by the enemy, but by the very system they had sworn to serve. It was the cruelest of ironies, that the very men who were supposed to be defending their country were being slowly destroyed by the lack of food, by the very thing that should have been sustaining them. And yet, despite the gnawing hunger that haunted their every waking moment, the soldiers had learned to endure. They had learned to live with it, to push the hunger to the back of their minds, to focus on the tasks at hand, even if those tasks seemed meaningless and futile. They had learned to take comfort in small things: the occasional letter from home, the brief moments of camaraderie between comrades, the fleeting joy of a hot drink on a cold morning. But the hunger always lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. It was a constant companion, and it had begun to break the men in ways they had never imagined. The men's bodies had begun to waste away. Their faces had become gaunt, their once muscular frames now reduced to thin, brittle forms. They moved with a sluggishness that betrayed their exhaustion, their every action seeming to take more effort than it was worth. Their minds, too, were becoming dull, their thoughts sluggish and unfocused. The hunger was eating away at them, not just physically but mentally as well. They found it harder to concentrate, harder to make decisions, harder to keep up with the demands of the war. The constant lack of food was eroding their will to fight, their will to live. They had begun to wonder if this was what it had all been for, if this was what they had signed up for when they first answered the call to arms. They had come to the front expecting heroism, but what they found was a slow, painful death that stretched on without end. As the days stretched into weeks, the soldiers began to fear something far worse than death, the fear that they might never eat again. They had heard rumors that the food supply was running low, that the men in other trenches were already starving, that the logistics of the war were so disorganized that there was little hope of food ever reaching them again. These rumors, though unsubstantiated, took hold of the men's minds, feeding their growing sense of panic. The thought of going without food, of never knowing when they would next eat, became a terrifying prospect. Hunger was no longer just a physical sensation. It had become a psychological terror, a force that was breaking them from the inside out. And then there were the cooks, strange figures in this world of death and destruction. They were not soldiers, but men who had been sent to the front not to fight, but to feed. They were largely invisible to the soldiers, their role seemingly insignificant compared to the battles being fought just a few yards away. But to the men in the trenches, the arrival of food, any food, was a miracle. The cooks were often greeted with skepticism, even hostility, as though their presence was some sort of cruel joke. How could they, who had never known the horrors of battle, understand the depths of suffering the men were enduring? How could they possibly bring anything but more disappointment? But even in the midst of their bitterness and exhaustion, the soldiers could not deny the desperate hope that flickered inside them at the sight of the cooks. The very thought of food, however small, however humble, was enough to stir something inside them. The hunger was a constant presence, gnawing at their souls, but the thought of being fed, of having their basic need for sustenance met, was a fleeting but powerful dream. It was a hope that they clung to, even if they didn't believe it would ever come to fruition. The men's minds, worn thin by hunger and war, were torn between disbelief and longing. Would the food actually arrive? Or was this just another false hope, another cruel joke in a world that had long since lost its sense of fairness? The question lingered in the air, unanswered and unresolved, as the men braced themselves for what would come next in this cycle of despair. The arrival of the cooks was a moment both strange and unexpected, a disruption in the daily monotony of suffering that had become the men's only reality. They came not with the urgency of soldiers, but with a quiet, almost unassuming presence. To the men who had long since grown accustomed to the harsh, immediate demands of battle, the cooks were an anomaly, their role so distant from the combat that it felt almost irrelevant. These were not the men who carried rifles, who dug trenches, or who manned the front lines. These men wore aprons and carried pots, their faces weathered not by the elements of war, but by the long hours spent over open flames, stirring stews, and preparing meager rations. They were the bearers of a different kind of hope, a hope that felt both necessary and out of place, as fragile as the food they had come to deliver. At first, the soldiers watched them with a mix of skepticism and indifference. These cooks were not their comrades, not men who had endured the horrors of battle. They had not seen their friends die in front of them or felt the ground shake beneath the thundering roar of artillery shells. They were strangers, outsiders in a war that had long since been reduced to the raw struggle for survival. And yet, there they were, moving through the trench with an air of calm that the soldiers could hardly comprehend. Their movements were measured and precise, each action steeped in the routine of providing nourishment, a routine that seemed almost laughable in the face of such unrelenting violence. The cooks seemed oblivious to the oppressive weight of the trench. They walked with a quiet purpose, as if their very presence carried with it a sense of normalcy that was foreign to the soldiers. They didn't flinch at the grim surroundings, the thick mud that seemed to consume everything it touched, the walls of the trench that had been scoured by constant rain and the wear of battle, the rats that scurried over the soldiers' belongings and food. To the men in the trench, every corner of the battlefield had become a reminder of death. Each moment spent there was like a slow erosion of hope. But the cooks didn't seem to notice the death hanging in the air. They simply got to work. The soldiers, at first, barely acknowledged the cooks. They had their own worries to contend with, and these men who came from a faraway support unit seemed like mere intruders in their world of war. The men's eyes were clouded with the fatigue of their endless struggles, and they could not see how something as simple as food could possibly change anything. How could it? They had been hungry for so long. Food had become just another cruel joke in a landscape already dominated by suffering. The very thought that the cooks could offer them relief seemed both alien and impossible. They had grown used to the idea that food was not a given, that sustenance was a luxury reserved for those in the rear, for those who were not living through the ceaseless grind of the front lines. And yet, as the cooks began their work, a subtle shift began to take place. There was no fanfare, no announcement that the meal was ready, and no display of grandeur. The food was not lavish, it was never going to be a feast worthy of royalty. But it was something the men hadn't tasted in what felt like an eternity, a promise of warmth, of nourishment, and of comfort. The cooks moved through the trench, setting up small cooking stations and filling pots with the few ingredients they had. The smell of boiling water, of stew bubbling softly, was like a strange melody in the midst of the desolation. The soldiers, weary and battle-worn, could barely bring themselves to acknowledge it at first. But as the scent of food wafted through the trench, something began to stir in the hearts of the men. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was something like it, an ember of possibility, a flicker of belief that they might not have to live in this endless hunger after all. The cooks worked with a quiet intensity, their focus solely on the task at hand. They didn't seem to notice the soldiers' expressions, some skeptical, some desperate, others simply too numb to care. The cooks were not there to question the men's pain or to offer comforting words. They were there to do one simple thing: to feed them. The contrast between the cooks' calm efficiency and the men's palpable exhaustion was stark. The soldiers, who had been hardened by the brutal rhythms of war, watched the cooks as they worked, their eyes drawn to the food with a mixture of disbelief and longing. Could this truly be happening? Could they really be about to eat something more than the stale, tasteless rations they had been living off of for so long? The cooks moved with the steady rhythm of men who had prepared food in kitchens for years. There was no hesitation in their movements, no signs of uncertainty. They knew their task, and they performed it with the kind of professionalism that made the men's hunger even more unbearable. The soldiers knew that the cooks weren't there to fight, to risk their lives alongside them in the trenches. They were just men, going about their job with the same quiet purpose that they would have displayed in a civilian kitchen. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the soldiers feel both resentful and grateful. Could these cooks truly understand the depths of the men's suffering? Could they grasp the magnitude of the hunger that had begun to consume them from the inside out? The soldiers didn't know, but in that moment, they didn't care. They were hungry, and the cooks had brought food. The work was methodical and efficient. The cooks did not speak much, moving back and forth, exchanging glances only when necessary. The soldiers, too, were silent, their eyes fixed on the food being prepared before them. It wasn't just food that the men were waiting for, though. It was a connection, a fleeting moment of relief from the torment they had endured. The soldiers didn't expect a miracle. They didn't expect to suddenly feel as if all their troubles had been wiped away. But they did expect to feel something, a shift, a temporary reprieve from the constant ache of hunger, both physical and emotional. As the cooks finished preparing the first round of meals, they began to serve the soldiers in small, orderly groups. There were no grand speeches, no gestures of goodwill. The cooks simply handed out bowls, each one filled with whatever rations had been prepared. The soldiers took the bowls with hands that trembled from hunger, their eyes flickering with an expression that was hard to place. For some, it was disbelief. For others, it was hope, tinged with skepticism. For a few, it was a strange mix of gratitude and shame. They had been so used to surviving on the barest of rations, so used to the bitter taste of defeat, that they could hardly believe that someone was offering them something more. As they began to eat, the trench fell into a silence that was almost reverent. There were no words spoken, no one knew what to say. The act of eating itself was too intimate, too personal, too fraught with meaning. The soldiers had spent so long in a state of deprivation, both physical and spiritual, that the simple act of receiving food felt like a kind of salvation, even if it was fleeting. For the first time in what seemed like years, the soldiers allowed themselves to feel something more than hunger, something more than the numbness that had overtaken them for so long. The food wasn't just nourishment, it was an offering, a gesture of care in a world where such things had become scarce. The cooks, with their quiet determination and unwavering focus, had given the men more than just food. They had given them a brief moment of connection to something outside the trench, a reminder that they were not forgotten, that there were still those who cared enough to bring them something more than death and despair. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that moment, the soldiers could feel the weight of their hunger lift, if only temporarily. It was a small victory in a world where victory had long since become a distant dream. But in that small act of nourishment, in the simple task of feeding the soldiers, the cooks had given the men something they had not known they had lost: hope, however fragile it might have been. And for the first time in a long time, that small flicker of hope began to burn a little brighter. As the cooks continued their work in the trench, something began to shift in the atmosphere, though no one could immediately name it. At first, there had been nothing more than the quiet preparation of meals, small pots of stew, simple loaves of bread, and the hum of routine that followed. The soldiers had been slow to warm to the idea of receiving food from these men, strangers who had no place in the brutality of battle, no shared bond of blood and violence. But as the meal was served, there was a subtle change that no one could deny. Hunger, that ever-present gnawing force that had clouded their every thought, began to recede, even if only for a fleeting moment. And in that pause, something new arose, something more intangible and more profound than the satisfaction of a full belly. The men, who had been so hardened by the grueling realities of war, sat in an unexpected silence as they ate. The trench, usually a cacophony of grim chatter, the distant rumble of artillery, the rustling of muddy boots, fell into a rare stillness. No one spoke for the first few moments, as if some unwritten rule had descended over the men. This was not a time for words, but for the rare experience of simply being fed. Their hands trembled slightly as they grasped their bowls, their fingers curling around the edges of the metal in an unconscious need to hold onto something solid, something real, something that wasn't soaked in blood or fear. The food, simple as it was, had an almost magical effect. The smell, rich and savory, filled the air of the trench, cutting through the usual stench of sweat, decay, and the lingering fumes of gunpowder. For the first time in weeks, the men found themselves lost in the sensual pleasure of the moment. The warmth of the stew against their lips, the roughness of the bread, the taste of something that was not rancid or stale. It was nourishment, yes, but it was also comfort. It was a balm for their souls, an answer to a question they hadn't dared to ask for fear of the disappointment that might follow. Could they ever find relief from this hunger, from this endless spiral of deprivation? The soldiers ate quietly, with a solemn reverence that made the act of consuming food feel almost sacred. As the men ate, the atmosphere of the trench began to shift in ways that were hard to articulate. The usual hardened expressions, the grim lines of exhaustion and anger that had long since become permanent fixtures on their faces, softened just a little. They did not speak to each other immediately, but their eyes began to meet with a kind of understanding, a wordless acknowledgement that something rare was happening here. It wasn't just the food, it was the realization that someone, somewhere, cared enough to bring it to them, to take the time and make the effort to reach them across the desolation of the front lines. The cooks, who had continued to move silently among the men, seemed unaware of the subtle shift that was taking place. They did not seek recognition or applause. Their task was simple, and they carried it out without fanfare. They had no illusions about the world they were in, no delusions that their food could change the course of the war, or even change the men they served. They were not heroes, at least not in the traditional sense. But as they moved from soldier to soldier, serving the food with quiet efficiency, there was something in the way they did their work that made their presence more powerful than any grand gesture could ever be. They were not there to save anyone. They were there to provide, to offer a brief respite from the madness. And in that moment, in the silence that followed the distribution of food, they had succeeded in doing just that. For the soldiers, however, it was an experience that defied easy explanation. They had come to the front with the understanding that they were soldiers first, that their mission was to fight and to survive. But here, in the midst of the constant rain of shells, the mud that sucked at their boots, and the oppressive fear of death that hung over them like a dark cloud, they were forced to reckon with something else, their humanity. The food, simple as it was, called forth a deep-seated need for connection, for something other than the violence that had defined their existence for so long. It wasn't just about satisfying the hunger in their stomachs, it was about something more profound, something more primal. It was about the desire to be cared for, to be seen as more than just soldiers, to be reminded that they were, in fact, human beings. In the moments after they had finished eating, the men lingered in a strange, almost uncomfortable silence. It was as though they were afraid to break the spell, to shatter the rare, fragile calm that had settled over the trench. For the first time in what felt like ages, they found themselves at a loss for words. The usual banter, the crude jokes, the quiet complaints about the war, all of it seemed trivial, almost offensive in the wake of what they had just experienced. What could they say in the face of something as simple, yet as profound, as a meal given without expectation? What words could capture the depth of the gratitude they felt, the recognition that someone, a stranger to them, had cared enough to bring them something so basic, yet so meaningful? For some of the men, it wasn't just the food that left a mark. It was the quiet presence of the cooks themselves. They moved through the trench like shadows, barely noticeable, their work done with an almost reverent focus. They did not offer speeches or grand gestures. They did not seek the soldiers' approval. They were simply there, quietly going about their task, and in doing so, they had achieved something greater than words could convey. The soldiers, in turn, began to look at them differently. These men, who had once seemed so out of place in the chaos of war, now appeared as something more. They were a reminder of a world that still held the potential for kindness, for decency, for care. In a place where everything had been reduced to survival, the cooks stood as quiet witnesses to the enduring human spirit. As the minutes passed, the soldiers began to speak. The first words were tentative, whispered almost as if they were afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over them. But then, slowly, they began to open up. There was no grand proclamation, no dramatic turning point. It was in the small exchanges, the shared looks, the words that came not as an attempt to make sense of the war, but as a simple acknowledgement of the humanity that still resided in each of them. They spoke of their homes, their families, the lives they had left behind. They spoke not of glory, but of the things that mattered most to them, things that had been lost in the chaos of war. For the first time in what felt like years, they allowed themselves to connect with one another on a level that had nothing to do with the war. They were not soldiers in that moment. They were simply men, sharing a meal and a moment of respite in a world that had forgotten how to offer either. But even as they spoke, there was something more subtle taking place. Beneath the words, beneath the stories and the laughter, was the quiet understanding that the food, the simple act of being fed, had done something far more profound than they had ever anticipated. It had reminded them of who they were before the war. It had reminded them of the bonds they had once shared with others, of the connections that had been forged not in the crucible of battle, but in the quiet, everyday acts of care and kindness. The war had stripped them of so much, but it had not yet taken away their ability to feel, to connect, to remember. And as the last bowls were emptied and the cooks prepared to leave, a strange sense of loss settled over the trench. The men, who had barely noticed the cooks when they first arrived, now found themselves watching them with a new understanding. They had done something the soldiers had not thought possible. They had brought a glimmer of warmth to a place that had known only coldness for so long. The men knew that the war would continue, that hunger would return, that suffering would again become their constant companion. But for this brief moment, the cooks had given them something more valuable than food. They had given them a moment of peace, of humanity, of connection that they would carry with them even as the chaos of war closed in once more. As the bowls were passed around and the soldiers began to eat, the atmosphere in the trench shifted in ways that were almost impossible to put into words. The noise of the war, the unrelenting bombardments, the constant hum of rifles firing in the distance, seemed to recede for a brief moment, as though the very air around the men had changed. It wasn't the cessation of battle that brought this transformation, nor was it the mere act of eating. It was something more, something deeper, that had quietly entered the trench along with the food. The soldiers, for the first time in what felt like forever, allowed themselves to pause, to acknowledge the simplest of human needs that had long been denied them: to eat, to nourish their bodies, to survive. But more than that, they began to realize that the meal wasn't just about filling the hollow emptiness inside them. It was something else entirely. It was the first real moment of grace they had experienced in a long, long time. Each soldier sat hunched over his bowl, the spoon moving rhythmically between his mouth and the stew, as though the action had become mechanical at first. But as the warmth of the food began to seep into their bones, something started to change. It wasn't that the men had been starving, though they had, in fact, been ravenous for weeks, but it was the suddenness of the relief, the unanticipated comfort, that struck them with such force. The simple act of being nourished, of tasting something that wasn't stale or canned or made from whatever scraps could be found, seemed to awaken something deep within them that had been dormant for far too long. The soldiers had long since become accustomed to suffering. It had become a part of their identity. Pain, hunger, fatigue, and death were their daily companions, so much so that they had forgotten what it felt like to experience something else. But here, in the midst of all the chaos, all the terror of the war surrounding them, they had been given something that transcended mere survival. For a few precious moments, they felt human again. The warmth of the food began to work its magic slowly, like sunlight breaking through a long storm. For some of the men, it was a subtle shift. Their shoulders, which had been rigid with the strain of constant vigilance, began to loosen. Their clenched jaws relaxed slightly, the tightness of their faces, so familiar now after months of grueling conflict, softened as they savored the warmth of the meal. They didn't look at each other right away. They didn't need to. There was something in the silence that spoke volumes. It was a shared experience, a brief return to the comfort of something basic and good in the midst of the madness. The food, though humble, filled not only their stomachs but something else, something deeper, something they had almost forgotten was missing. It was a reminder of the world they had left behind, the world of family dinners, of shared moments at the table, of being part of a larger community that cared for them. That world, which had seemed so distant for so long, now felt just within reach again, if only for a moment. For others, the effect was more immediate, more profound. The men who had been hardest hit by the war, those whose bodies were the most worn down by the lack of food and rest, those whose spirits had been shattered by the weight of endless battle, seemed to experience something akin to a brief awakening. One soldier, his face gaunt and his hands shaking as he lifted the bowl to his lips, closed his eyes for a moment as if to savor the sensation. For him, the act of eating was not just about nourishing his body, but about reclaiming a part of himself that had been lost. It was as though he had been running on empty for so long that the very act of taking something in, of receiving, of being given something, was almost too much to bear. Tears welled up in his eyes, though he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand, as though ashamed of such a vulnerable response. The men who saw it didn't say anything, but they understood. They too felt something stirring inside them, something that had been buried under the weight of their uniforms, their rifles, their hatred for the war. They too felt the sting of something that had been denied them for far too long. There were no words, no expressions of thanks or gratitude. There didn't need to be. The silence in the trench was heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of experiences that couldn't be shared in mere conversation. The soldiers ate, their eyes occasionally meeting in the dim light, their faces softened for once by something other than the grimace of war. They ate slowly, savoring the warmth, the texture of the food. Some even found themselves chewing more carefully, as though prolonging the experience, afraid that if they rushed through it, it might slip away too quickly. The food, in all its simplicity, was a fleeting moment of peace in a world that had become anything but peaceful. It wasn't just the soldiers who were affected by the food. The cooks, who had continued their work with quiet diligence, were now finishing their task, moving through the trench with the same purposeful steps, taking care to ensure that everyone had been served. They had been so focused on the task at hand, on the cooking, on getting the meals ready, that they hadn't fully understood the effect their actions might have. They were simply doing their job after all. But now, as they looked around the trench, they saw something they hadn't expected. The soldiers, who had once looked at them with a mixture of skepticism and disdain, were now eating with an intensity that surprised them. There was something almost reverent in the way the men consumed their food, as if it was more than just sustenance. It was a gift. The cooks glanced at each other briefly, exchanging silent looks, their own faces a mix of quiet pride and something else. They didn't need to speak. They understood that, in this small way, they had accomplished something that transcended the ordinary tasks of daily life. They had done something good in a world that had known little goodness for too long. The moment was fleeting, but it was powerful. The soldiers, who had spent so much of their time focused on the harsh realities of war, on the fight for survival, on the fear of death, on the constant noise of battle, were for once given something that wasn't tainted by the violence of their surroundings. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the fact that, in that moment, they had been cared for. For so long, they had given everything to the war, but now, in the smallest of ways, the war had given something back. It was an act of kindness, simple and unremarkable, but one that would resonate with the men long after the last bowl had been emptied. As the last of the food was eaten and the men began to set their bowls aside, there was a strange sense of quiet contentment that settled over the trench. It wasn't the kind of contentment that came from victory or triumph. It wasn't the kind of contentment that could come from a battle well fought or an enemy well defeated. It was the kind of contentment that came from something much simpler, the knowledge that, for a brief moment, they had been taken care of. The soldiers, whose lives had been defined by the relentless pursuit of survival, had been reminded of something that they had nearly forgotten: the value of a simple meal, of kindness offered without expectation, of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. It wasn't a solution to their suffering. It wasn't the end of the war, nor was it the end of their hunger. But it was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the earth, there was still the possibility for light. The soldiers began to speak again, though their words were not as sharp or cynical as before. They spoke quietly, almost as if they were afraid to break the fragile peace that had descended over the trench. They spoke of their homes, of the lives they had left behind, of the things they missed. They spoke not of the war, but of the lives they had once known, lives that now seemed like distant memories. They spoke of a time when they had been more than just soldiers, more than just survivors. They spoke, not with the bitterness that had once defined their every conversation, but with a softness that surprised even them. In those moments, the war seemed a little less pressing, a little less consuming. They had tasted something sweeter, something simpler. And for that brief time, that small moment, they allowed themselves to hold on to it. The cooks left the trench quietly, their work done. They did not stay for the conversations that followed, did not wait for thanks or recognition. Their presence had been temporary, but it had been enough. As they disappeared into the distance, the soldiers were left with a strange feeling that they had been given something they hadn't expected, something they didn't know they needed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, the soldiers felt something other than hunger, something other than the bitter taste of war. They felt, if only for a moment, that they might just make it through after all. The food was gone now, the last spoonfuls of stew and bits of bread devoured, leaving only the lingering warmth in the men's bodies as a reminder of what had just occurred. The trench, once again, fell into its familiar rhythm. The silence that had enveloped the men during their meal remained, but it was no longer heavy with the anxious weight of hunger. Instead, it felt almost sacred, as if the act of eating had carved out a small space in their existence where time could stand still, if only for a few moments. The soldiers sat back in their positions, their bodies still recovering from the shock of nourishment. It was a strange feeling, one that they hadn't experienced in so long. They had forgotten what it felt like to be satisfied in such a basic, elemental way. The hunger, which had gnawed at them day and night, had been momentarily silenced. But more than that, they felt something else, a kind of quiet peace that lingered in the air, fragile but present, like the calm after a storm.